which would essentially imprison the rest even more tightly if Gaza is separated from the West Bank. Now, that's the major geostrategic reason for the Israeli insistence, with U.S. backing, on separating the two in violation of the Oslo agreements and the series of ceasefires that have been reached since November 2005. Well, the November 2005 agreement lasted for a few weeks. In January 2006, a very important event took place, the first full free election in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair. It had one flaw. It came out the wrong way. Hamas won the parliament, control of the parliament. U.S. and Israel didn't want that. You may recall at that period, the slogan on everyone's lips was democracy promotion. The highest U.S. commitment in the world was democracy promotion. Here was a good test. Democracy. Election came out the wrong way. The U.S. instantly decided, along with Israel, to punish the Palestinians for the crime of voting the wrong way. A harsh siege was instituted, other punishments, violence increased. The United States immediately began to organize a military coup to overthrow the unacceptable government. That's quite familiar practice. I won't go through the record. The European Union, to its shame and discredit, went along with this. There was an immediate Israeli escalation. That was the end of the November agreement, followed by major Israeli onslaughts. In 2007, a year later, Hamas committed even a greater crime than winning a fair election. It preempted the planned military coup and took over Gaza. That's described in the West, in the United States, most of the West, as Hamas's taking over Gaza by force, which is not false, but something is omitted. The force was preempting a planned military coup to overthrow the elected government. That was a serious crime. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election. To preempt a U.S. planned military coup is far more serious. The attack on Gaza increased substantially at that point, major Israeli onslaughts. Finally, in January 2008, another ceasefire was reached. Terms were pretty much the same as those that I quoted. Israel publicly rejected the ceasefire, said that it would not abide by it. Hamas observed the ceasefire, as Israel officially recognizes, despite Israel's refusal to do so. Now, that continued until November 4th, 2008. On November 4th, which was the day of the U.S. election, Israeli forces invaded Gaza, killed half a dozen Hamas militants. That led to Qassam rockets attacking Israel, huge Israeli.
DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we return to MIT professor Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author. Last week, he spoke before over 800 people in the hall of the United Nations General Assembly, before ambassadors and the public alike, on the issue of Israel and Palestine. After his speech, I conducted a public interview with Professor Chomsky. What do you think is the single most important action the United States can take, and what about its role over the years? What is its interest here?
Well, one important action that the United States could take is to live up to its own laws. Of course, it would be nice if it lived up to international law, but maybe that's too much to ask. But live up to its own laws. And There are several. And here, incidentally, I have in mind advice to activists also, who I think ought to be organizing and educating in this direction. There are two crucial cases. One of them is what's called the Leahy Law. Patrick Leahy, Senator Leahy, introduced legislation called the Leahy Law, which bars sending weapons to any military units which are involved in consistent human rights violations. There isn't the slightest doubt that the Israeli army is involved in massive human rights violations, which means that all dispatch of U.S. arms to Israel is in violation of U.S. law. I think that's significant. The U.S. should be called upon by its own citizens and by others to adhere to U.S. law, which also happens to conform to international law in this case, as Amnesty International, for example, for years has been calling for an arms embargo against Israel for this reason. These are all steps that can be taken. The second is the tax-exempt status that is given to organizations in the United States which are directly involved in the occupation and in significant attacks on human and civil rights within Israel itself, like the Jewish National Fund. Take a look at its charter with the State of Israel, which commits it to acting for the benefit of people of Jewish race, religion, and origin within Israel. One of the consequences of that is that by a complex array of laws and administrative practices, the fund pretty much administers about 90% of the land of the country, with real consequences for who can live places. They get tax-exempt status also for their activities in the West Bank, which are strictly criminal. I think that's also straight in violation of U.S. law. Now, those are important things, and I think the U.S. should be pressured internationally and domestically to abandon its virtually unilateral role in blocking a political settlement for the past 40 years, ever since the first veto in January 1976. That should be a major issue in the media, in convocations like this, in the United Nations, in domestic politics, and government politics, and so on.
The role of the media, can you talk about that, and particularly in the United States? And do you think that the opinion in the United States, public opinion, is shifting on this issue?
Well, the role of the media are somewhat shifting from uniform support for virtually everything that Israel does to, and of course, silence about the U.S. role. That's not just in the case of Israel, that's innumerable other cases as well. But it's slowly shifting, but nevertheless, one about, say, Operation Protective Edge, one can read in news reporting in the New York Times, major journal, a criticism of Hamas's assault on Israel during Protective Edge. Hamas's assault on Israel. Not exactly what happened, but that's what people are reading, and that's the way it's depicted. Israel is, over and over, it's pointed out, look, poor Israel is under attack. It has the right of self-defense. Everyone agrees to that. Actually, I agree too. Everyone has a right of self-defense. But that's not the question. The question is, do you have a right of self-defense by force, by violence? The answer is no for anyone, whether it's an individual or a state, unless you have exhausted peaceful means. If you won't even permit peaceful means, which is the case here, then you have no right of self-defense by violence. But try to find a word about that in the media. All you find is self-defense. When President Obama rarely says anything about what's happening, it's usually, if my daughters were being attacked by rockets, I would do anything to stop it. He's referring not to the hundreds of Palestinian children who are being killed and slaughtered, but to the children in the Israeli town of Sderot, which is under attack by Qassam missiles. And remember that Israel knows exactly how to stop those missiles, namely live up to a ceasefire for the first time. And then they would stop, as in the past, even when Israel didn't live up to a ceasefire. That framework, and of course the rest of the framework is the United States is an honest broker trying hard to bring the two recalcitrant sides together, doing its best in this noble endeavor, has nothing to do with the case. The U.S. is, as some of the U.S. negotiators have occasionally acknowledged, Israel's lawyer. If there were serious negotiations going on, they would be led by some neutral party, maybe Brazil, which has some international respect, and they would bring together the two sides. On the one side, Israel and the United States. On the other side, the Palestinians. Those would be possible realistic negotiations. But the chances of anyone in the media either, I won't even say pointing it out, even thinking about it is minuscule. The indoctrination is so deep that really elementary facts like these, and they are elementary, are almost incomprehensible. But to get back to the last point you mentioned, it's very important. Opinion in the United States is shifting. Not as fast as in most of the world, not as fast as in Europe. It's not reaching the point where you could get a vote in Congress, anything like the British Parliament a couple days ago. But it is changing, mostly among younger people, and changing substantially. I'll just illustrate with personal experience. Amy has the same experience. Until pretty recently, when I gave talks on these topics, as I've been doing for 40 years, I literally had to have police protection, even at my own university, MIT. Police would insist on walking me back to my car because of threats they'd picked up. Meetings were broken up, and so on. That's all gone. Just a couple of days ago, I had a talk on these topics at MIT. Meeting wasn't broken up, no police protection. Maybe 500 or 600 students were there, all enthusiastic, engaged, committed, concerned, wanting to do something about it. That's happening all over the country. All over the country. Palestinian solidarity is one of the biggest issues on campus. Enormous change in the last few years. That's the way things tend to change. It often starts with younger people. Gradually it gets to the rest of the population. Efforts of the kind I mentioned, say trying to get the United States government to live up to its own laws, those could be undertaken on a substantial scale, domestically and with support from international institutions. And that could lead to further changes. I think that for example, the two things that I mentioned would have a considerable appeal to much of the American public. Why should they be funding military units that are carrying out massive human rights violations? Why should they be permitting a tax exemption, meaning we pay for it? That's what a tax exemption means. Why should we be compelled to pay for violations of fundamental human rights in another country and even in occupied territories where it's criminal? I think that can appeal to the American population and can lead to the kinds of changes we've seen in other cases.